All right. Hey, everybody. Today's module and PowerPoint will be on fitness assessments, exercise physiology, and fitness assessments. Okay. So we're going to go through why we even perform tests, different ways to make sure that we're performing proper tests in the proper order. And then we're going to go through real briefly some specific tests for different assessments. Okay, so let's go over some key terms real quick. These might seem pretty similar at first, and they actually are similar. There's some carryover with all of them, but no, there's slight differences here. So a test is a procedure for assessing ability in a particular endeavor. So we would choose, okay, we want to test for speed. We want to test for power. We want to test for aerobic capacity, etc. So we assess a particular endeavor or assess an ability in a particular endeavor. Measurement would be how we score that particular test. Okay, like I said, are we doing speed? Now we're talking about time in seconds. Power can be measured in many different ways. Let's say it's vertical jump. We're talking about height potentially, maybe watts, maybe newtons, a measurement of power or a measurement of force, I should say. Different tests have different measurements and scores. Okay, evaluation is basically a process of analyzing the test results so we can make a better decision. And then all encompassing all three of those is an assessment where we choose a test. So we choose what ability we want to test. We're going to measure it in the proper scales, and then we're going to analyze the results to make an evaluation. Okay. So fitness assessments. These are just some general questions that I would have asked you if we were there in person, but why is it important to routinely assess where an individual is at in their fitness plan and program? What are some different systems and fitness components that need to be tested? How can these tests be performed? And what tests do I need to have done? Okay, so different questions you might want to ask yourself, and by the end of this lecture, you should be able to answer all these. All right, so the main purposes of fitness or exercise physiology assessments, we want to determine baseline for measures of individual aspects of fitness. So essentially, we get an athlete or we get a client, we need to know where their starting point is. That's what a baseline is. Where are they starting at? And then another purpose of fitness assessments is to gauge our progress over time. So here's their baseline. Did they get better over time in whatever test we decide, whatever assessment we decide to perform? Okay. And I think this quote was from, I don't know where it originated from, but I think I heard it from Dr. Duncan French out of the UFCPI. If we're not assessing, we're guessing. Okay. So if we're not using any kind of assessments, we say, well, yeah, I think they're getting better, but we can't really tell. So that's a big need for assessments to see, here's where we're at. Did we get better? And then another main purpose is to compare individuals to each other. Okay, is this individual have enough, from a sport context, do they have enough speed, but maybe they don't have enough force, or vice versa? From a fitness component, is their body composition within a healthy range, or do we need to get their BMI or body fat down a little bit so it's in check? So I guess I could have written that as compare individuals to each other, but also to themselves. But it is good to have sort of a baseline and a chart of different people and what's considered healthy, what's considered good for this particular sport, sex, age, etc. So we can compare individuals. All right, so test selection. Prior to testing, a needs analysis must be conducted. And I know a couple weeks ago we hammered home pretty good with the needs analysis. But remember, needs analysis is from a group in or team level, physiological, biomechanical, injury analysis, and then also from an from an individual level, primarily focused on injury level. So before we even select a test, we have to do that needs analysis. So what kind of test do we need to select that's going to be appropriate for that sport, for that fitness component, for that individual? Okay, and that's what I put: test specificity, specific to the sport, occupation, goal, metabolic concerns, and specific to the population being tested. Population tested just would mean, like, say we do an assessment, and again, I come from a more of a sport background, but we decide that we want to test power because we're working with softball athletes. Okay, perfect. I would agree that power is important. How are we going to test power? We decide that a power clean is the best assessment of power. Okay, perfect. But now our population is 10 and 11-year-old female softball athletes. Maybe that specific assessment is not the best for that population being tested. Maybe we still want to test power. Now we do it with a vertical jump or a standing long jump or something like that. All right, another key point. Some of you guys may have heard of validity and reliability. Okay. When we select a test, we want to select tests that are both valid and reliable. Valid basically means if we have a target, we hit dead center of the target. We measure what it's supposed to measure. So for instance, I'll give you an example that's a test that's not valid, not the specific test, but let's say we're working with athlete and we want to test speed. Perfect. All right. And then we choose a 1 mile test for speed. Well, there's nothing wrong with that assessment, but it's not valid for measuring speed. It doesn't measure what we want it to measure. Okay. That's a crude example, but that's an example of that test is not valid for that specific assessment or that specific ability. Okay. So it measures what it's supposed to measure. Speed. Okay. We're going to do a 30-meter sprint, a 20-meter fly, something like that. Okay. The most important, so validity is the most important characteristic of testing. Okay. How well it compares with the gold standard. And each test has their own gold standard. And we'll talk about some of those gold standards. Some of the gold standards are sort of still being figured out, but most of them have been verified with scientific studies for a long time. Okay. All right, let's see. All right, perfect. Now reliability, on the other hand, now we have that same target, and reliability means regardless of if we hit bullseye, let's say we have a dartboard and we hit the 5 every time, or excuse me, the 5. Reliability means we hit that 5 every single time, even if it's far away from the bullseye being a valid test. Reliability means we hit that same point on the board, even if it's not necessarily valid. It doesn't maybe necessarily measure what it's supposed to be measuring. So example of this would be like a home scale that you measure your weight. Okay. What if that scale is 7 pounds off? It's always 7 pounds heavy. Well, it's not valid because it's not really measuring our weight. But if it's always that 7 pounds off, it's going to be reliable at least. So that means, well, if we lost 2 pounds, even if our actual total weight is not correct, still, if we get the same measurement every time and we lose 2 pounds, we know that we actually lost 2 pounds, even again, if our total weight is not accurate. Okay, and you can read that. Maybe I should have put this on the next slide, but a valid test must always be reliable, but a reliable test does not mean it is valid. Okay, so again, we can have reliability without validity. Okay. Oh, and here's an example of the dartboard. That's a perfect example. This is what we're aiming for. This is gold standard for all our tests. Reliable, we're hitting the same spot every time, and valid, we're hitting the bullseye every time. All right, now let's talk about some different fitness assessments. So types of testing, we got both field tests and laboratory tests. And then we can examine many different things. We're only going to touch upon a few. body composition, cardiorespiratory fitness, and musculoskeletal fitness, which includes many different things. Okay. And what is a field test? You might be asking yourself. That's essentially a test that we don't perform in a laboratory. Okay. And it's usually using inexpensive equipment. Now, some a little bit more expensive equipment you can take outside the lab, but it's usually outside the lab with inexpensive equipment. And most of these tests that we're going to examine will go through if they're field or laboratory based. So body composition, lab tests. So hydrostatic weighing. Unfortunately, we don't have this here at UCF, but I did this many times during my undergraduate career, and it's interesting, but it's cool to do the gold standard for body composition testing. Okay, so essentially what you do, and that's that top picture right here. You're going to be sitting on a little device and they're going to dunk you. You're going to exhale as much of the air as you can, and then you're going to hold still. And you can see here, you get a scale and reading. And based on that reading, you're going to do a few calculations and you get your body composition results. Okay. So for some people, it's very uncomfortable to exhale as much of their air as they can and then stay underwater. It wasn't an issue for myself personally, but some people do have an issue with that. Ours was interesting because it was not like a pool like this. It was actually, it looked like a big metal fish tank, and then it just had a hole where you could go down and you could see out while you were down below. Okay, and that's why it says not appropriate for everyone. DEXA is basically an X-ray scan, and that is a really good lab test. We actually have a DEXA, or had one, but they changed up the laws in Florida, so you had to have a medical degree to run this. So our doctors with PhDs from our lab ended up not being able to use it, but it's very good. But obese individuals, maybe, I mean, unfortunately, their sides might actually exceed off the table, or very tall athletes where their legs or their head hang off that. It's not really appropriate for those types of individuals, but for everyone else, it's very appropriate. And then bod pod, we do have one of these. So if you do one of our studies in the lab, there's a chance you might hop in the bod pod, which is cool. They use this, or last I checked, they use this for the NFL Combine. So you basically shed as much clothing as the researcher wants. You put a little skull cap on and you hop in there, and it has, it basically uses the pressure in that little bod pod to give you your body composition results. And so you hear little popping noises and sometimes your ears pop. But that's a cool one. And it only takes about 5 minutes to do, maybe 10 minutes at most, but that's a cool one. Very accurate. We have in the lab. And here's some field tests. I'm going to start with this BIA. We actually have an in-body bioelectrical impedance analysis that we have in the lab, but we take it out to the field. I don't know if we're supposed to, or if it's supposed to be portable, but we just carry it. I took it out to many different sites throughout my time. But basically, you stand on there, it sends electrical impulses through your body. And as you can see here, lean tissue has more water in it than fat. So the electrical signals will travel back faster through lean tissue. And that's how it works. And then skin fold measurements. That's like the classic body composition field test. You can do it just with a pair of calipers. Once you know the sites and sort of know how to do it, it goes pretty fast, very cheap. And the more sites you do, the more accurate it is. This is actually something that I did with the baseball players I worked with the Houston Astros organization. I can't remember if we do it once a week. Yeah, it must have been once a week we would do it. And we would just do the 3 sites. So not the most accurate, but just a general body composition field test. All right, cardiorespiratory tests. The gold standard, I think I talked about this when we talked about aerobic fitness. Gold standard is our VO2 max test. And again, Generally, aerobic training is focused on improving VO2 max. For those athletes that have sort of maxed out their VO2 max, obviously training is focused on a few other things, but gold standard VO2 max test. Okay, it measures how much air or oxygen, excuse me, you're taking in, how much CO2 you're breathing out. So essentially, how much oxygen your body can consume and utilize. Okay, and that's usually done with a graded exercise test, either on a treadmill or a bike. I know I've done it on a treadmill several times, but I don't know if I've done it on a bike. But again, if I can recommend, I mean, I'm not an endurance athlete, but I would recommend if you guys get a chance, whether through a study or assessments class, to do a VO2 max, do it. I think it's a great experience, even though it's pretty tough. But here you can see it's they're using, well, let me go on to the next slide. They're using a metabolic cart, and they're using it for VO2 max testing. This is what we have in the lab, but we also actually have a portable metabolic cart that essentially is a little backpack that goes on your back, and then the wires will go around here, which we've used for a few different studies. The one that I was probably, well, two I was most involved with. One was with a bike. We used the K5s, and another one was with the rowing team, the women's rowing team here at UCF. And we would actually put those backpacks on the ladies while they were doing a erg test. So stationary rower, which was very specific to their sport. So that was the best thing. Now, we could have had them run on a treadmill, which would have been fine, but they're not as good at that. So it wouldn't have been as specific a VO2 max as hopping on the rower. Okay, so the metabolic cart is basically just this little cart that you can travel around, and you can do different testing with it. I would say we primarily use it for VO2 max, but we have used it for lactate threshold and resting metabolic rate, which was what this is. I was also involved with a study that we did RMR, resting metabolic rate. And again, assessments class, you should have opportunity to do RMR. This one, I don't know if you need to do it because you basically just lay there and breathe. But it is a cool thing to at least see. Field tests of cardiorespiratory fitness. I've never done any of these myself actually, but step test, something you will do an assessment. Rockport 1 mile walk test. I'm not sure if you do that. You can read through those calculations. Let me know if you got any questions with those. I'm not going to make you memorize that, by the way. You may have to for assessment class, but not for this class. Another field test for cardiorespiratory fitness, the bulk 15-minute run test. And then just of note, the field tests are sub-max, and so they're not actually directly measuring gas exchange. They don't have anything over your mouth measuring how much oxygen you take in, how much CO2 you breathe out. So they are probably estimate, and they usually underestimate VO2 max. So those are our field tests for cardiorespiratory fitness. Now, like I said, if we use the K5, the backpack, and we go out to the soccer pitch and do VO2 max there, that's directly measuring gas exchange. So you can expect that to be much more accurate than these sub-max tests. Musculoskeletal testing, okay? Lab tests, a bunch of different lab tests. We'll just touch upon a few that we use in the lab. Isokinetic dynamometry, okay? This is basically the isokinetic or the biodex machine. So essentially what this is, you can set it up at different joint angles, different types of tests. Here it looks to be leg extension, it might be leg curl, but essentially this machine is going to limit how fast or how slow you can move. So you can exert as much force as possible, and if you have it at a slow speed, it's not going to go any faster than the speed entails. Okay, so some of our researchers use that quite a bit in testing. I've only used it with elderly population, and it wasn't for an actual study. EMG, or electromyography, measures electrical activity of the muscle during contraction. So you can see here, those are little EMG sensors measuring the activity of the quadriceps during what seems to be a leg extension. Okay. And this is Dr. Stock, who runs one of our labs in our department, is really big into EMG. And that's a cool thing. You can see sort of motor unit utilization and recruitment. It's an interesting area of research. I didn't really get into it too much, but if you're interested in that, I would definitely look at Dr. Stock's research. And then ultrasonography or ultrasound, I did use this for a study as well. You essentially can measure the thickness of the muscle. So this is a snapshot. And here you can see the top of the muscle, the bottom of the muscle, and those are the individual fascicles, muscle fascicles going through there. So you can measure pennation angle, you can measure the thickness of the muscle, you can even measure the thickness of subcutaneous fat in there. And here's a cross-sectional area or cross-sectional snapshot of the muscle. So here looks to be a quadricep. Oops, whoops. And there you can see the muscle is actually outlined here. So again, we can get the actual cross-sectional area of the muscle. So for instance, if the study I worked on, we were looking at cross-sectional area of the muscle to see if it increased in size after a resistance training program. Now, field test, muscular strength, 1 rep max, 2 rep max, 3 rep max. That's probably the most common field test of muscular strength. You can do a few other things, but you typically go through some kind of multiple set, not a warm up, but prep sets, and then you get after your maximal effort. Okay. Muscular endurance would be, these were more common years ago when they did like the Army fitness test, the military fitness test. They would do a 1 minute test for sit up, muscular endurance, 1 minute test for push up, is essentially how much you can do in that period of time. And it's isolating or it's focused on certain muscle groups. Okay. Field tests of power, many different ones of these. I already talked about vertical jump. If we jump for height, maybe we have a little force plate where we jump and we see peak power on the force plate. Olympic lifts, again, I talked about that with our softball ladies, if we wanted to do a power clean, but they were only 10 or 11 years old. Here's a cycle test, Wingate. I believe I talked about a few weeks ago when it came to anaerobic. That's a test of anaerobic performance. Okay. You can calculate power either directly or indirectly, and the resistance is set to 7.5% of body mass, and you're going max for 30 seconds. Again, it is not fun, for me at least, to perform this test, but I would suggest, if you guys have the opportunity to do this in assessment or in a study, to perform a Wingate test at least one time. Okay, just to experience it, and you'll remember it, trust me. Now, I think we were supposed to keep our butt down, but this guy looks to be a cyclist, so I guess they're allowing him to do that. Field test of flexibility. We're basically assessing the range of motion of a specific joint. Okay, so not a muscle. So we're not testing hamstring flexibility, although it is indirectly related. We're testing flexibility of the hip joint, so hip flexion. Okay, sit and reach, shoulder flexibility, ankle flexibility. Here we can see a couple. This is flexibility of the hips and lower back. And this is a common assessment that we've done. I've done with the soccer players here at UCF. You basically sit, you push a little dial forward as much as you can, and you get that measurement. Flexibility test, just if you can touch your hands together, that's a simple shoulder flexibility test. And then finally, testing order. I know there's a lot of writing on this, but these A's are just examples of the testing order. So testing order, we do resting test first, obviously, because they're the easiest one where we don't have to do anything. We're actually resting. Then non-fatiguing tests. Then we have agility tests, such as a T-test or hexagon test. So basically where we need a lot of central nervous system activity, followed by maximal power and strength test. Again, a lot of central nervous system activity, but maybe not as much as agility. Because, well, we haven't covered it, but agility is different than change of direction in that you have to react to a stimulus. So you react to a light, a whistle, a sound, and you change direction. followed by sprint tests. To be honest with you, I don't know how I would feel. I don't think I ever have done a 1 rep max strength test prior to a sprint test. Just letting you know from a practical standpoint, I don't think I would do that. I would probably do agility, then sprint, then max power and strength, but that's what the book says. So we're going to follow that. Then we got local muscular endurance tests, followed by anaerobic capacity, and then finally submax capacity. So as you can see here, from 3 down, we're basically going from the most central nervous system activity all the way to the least. Okay, so, or you can think of it as type 2X muscle fibers. As we go down, we're primarily focused on type 1 muscle fibers. And that's a lecture for today. As always, let me know if you got any questions.